the Model 1894 Winchester in 30-30. It's not always thought of as a martial arm, however these were issued to various military services. And in World War II, some were issued to the Canadian Pacific Coast Militia Rangers, the P.C.M.R. This is one of those rifles which we'll look at in detail today. I'm wearing one of the P.C.M.R. uniforms. This is the original jacket, and it's called a dryback. It's for the wet weather that we have here on the West Coast. The armband is an original. This is the earlier type of identification, and eventually they came up with their shoulder titles. And the beret and cap badge are also original Pacific Coast Militia Ranger issue. Enjoy the video. Welcome to the Captain Stevens channel. My name is Colin McGregor Stevens, and I am a retired Canadian Army infantry captain. And I'm also the curator of 12 Service Battalion Museum, which is an official Canadian Forces museum located in Richmond, British Columbia, Canada. The Model 1894 Winchester. We're going to do a safety check here. Make sure she has nothing in the chamber. Release the hammer under control, nothing in the tube magazine. In 30-30, Winchester center fire, developed 1894, designed by John M. Browning for the Winchester Company. Lever action, as we say in Canada, or lever action as the Americans would say. Very light in weight. It's only 6 pounds, 13 ounces, or about 3 kilograms. Contrast that with a standard service rifle which weighed about 9 pounds in the Canadian Army at that time. Now the length of this carbine is 38 inches or about 96.52 centimeters. The barrel is round, 20 inches long or 50.8 centimeters. It's a very compact action, very lightweight rifle, flat sides, easy to carry, but you would load it through the side gate here, pushing your cartridges in that way, and then working the lever would chamber a cartridge. So we have sights. The rear sight is an open notch sight, and we have a post with a bead at the front. So these were very, very popular hunting rifles. Over 7 million Model 1894 Winchesters have been made over the decades. The Pacific Coast Militia Rangers used these from 1942 to 45, and about 2,500 of these were on issue to them. In World War II, which lasted from 1939 to 1945, Canada was a member of the Allies fighting against the Axis powers, the Nazi Germans, the fascist Italians, and their allies. Then, in December 1941, Japan joined in the war by attacking Pearl Harbor in the USA. Suddenly, the USA and Canada faced a new enemy on the West Coast. Was there ever a real threat of a Japanese attack on the West Coast of Canada and the USA? Yes, there was. The Japanese threats to the West Coast of North America could be by submarines. Some Allied ships were sunk along the west coast of North America. Mines could be laid by submarines. Surface vessels could come over here, and you could have aircraft carriers or warships. Aircraft could be transported by an aircraft carrier, by submarine, surprisingly, or launched from forward airfields. Possible sabotage was another way that the Japanese could threaten North America. So what did Americans and Canadians think at this time, 1942? They looked across the Pacific and they could see that Japan was emerging as a superpower as it swept through the South Pacific, toppling British and American defenses in the Far East. Hong Kong, which was partly defended by 2 Canadian battalions, was captured on December 25, 1941. Guam, Wake Island, Malaya, Singapore, the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, Siam, which we now call Thailand, these all fell to the Japanese naval and military forces, which seemed to be unstoppable. On March 3, 1942, in Canada, the Pacific Coast Militia Rangers were formed. More about that in a minute. 3 months later, on June 3, 1942, Japanese aircraft dropped bombs on Dutch Harbor in Alaska. On June 6th and 7th, the Japanese captured and occupied 2 American islands in Alaska, Attu and Kiska. On June 20th, the Japanese submarine I-26 shelled Estevan Point Lighthouse on the west coast of Vancouver Island here in British Columbia, Canada. On June 21st, the very next day, another Japanese submarine, the I-25, fired 17 cannon shells at Fort Stevens, Oregon. On September 9th and 29th, 1942, the aircraft from this same Japanese submarine, the I-25, did 2 sorties, dropping incendiary bombs into areas on the coast of the USA to try and start forest fires. Later, in 1943, the island of Attu was liberated by the Americans, and this involved very heavy fighting and high casualties on both sides. Kiska, another island, was liberated by the Americans and the Canadians. In that case, the Japanese had quietly removed 5,193 soldiers under the cover of a heavy fog just before the Allied invasion. At the end of this video, I shall talk about the biggest threat by the Japanese Empire to the west coast of North America. Canada only had a small active army presence on the west coast, a naval base, and some Royal Canadian Air Force, RCAF, stations. Since September 10, 1939, Canada's main war effort was committed in Europe. Therefore, Canada's west coast, i.e. British Columbia, was left with minimal defenses. As the BC coastline is very, very long, it's 15,985 miles, or 25,725 kilometers long. That's just the west coast of British Columbia. The Pacific Coast Militia Rangers. P.C.M.R. members included those who were too young, too old, medically unfit for active service, workers in restricted or essential occupations such as logging, mining, fishing, ranching, dockyards, etc., and anyone who had experience of living and working in the woods, such as trappers and hunters, were very valuable. P.C.M.R. companies were organized by area. Eventually, there were 14,849 rangers in 132 companies across BC and a little bit in the Yukon. The rangers were as young as 16 and as old as at least 86. And these included many veterans of World War I, which was 1914 to 1919, and there were even some veterans from the Boer War, 1899 to 1902. The roles of the P.C.M.R. The world was very conscious of the value of guerrilla fighters in war. P.C.M.R. members were locals, and they knew their areas, and in a war could act as scouts or guerrilla fighters. Travel in British Columbia was very difficult. Having local P.C.M.R. Rangers on location in remote areas in particular was essential for Canadian security, as they were often the only military presence. The key roles of the P.C.M.R. were local defense, observation and reporting, anti-sabotage efforts such as guarding vulnerable points. Examples of these included a mountain pass, power stations, bridges, and even a heavy water facility which was part of the top-secret atomic bomb Manhattan Project. Search and rescue was an important function for the P.C.M.R. There were a lot of aircraft flying around British Columbia, patrolling the coast, flying in the interior, training flights, as well as operational flights. And then there were a lot of aircraft being ferried from the United States over to the USSR, the Soviet Union, as aid. Now the coast is very dangerous for flying because of a lot of fog and a lot of mountains. So there were many accidents, and the P.C.M.R. would be sent in to try and locate the crash and also to assist with any survivors who might be there. The Ranger. This included articles on weapons training, wartime experiences of lessons learned for those who were already fighting with the Japanese, navigation, signaling, edible plants in the bush, first aid, anything that they might need to know. Let's look at the distinguishing features of a P.C.M.R. Winchester. At first glance, we look at it, the most obvious thing is the sling. So the standard thing was to fit a Ross rifle sling swivel on the butt. Because there was no sling swivel at the front, the P.C.M.R. members sometimes wrapped the sling. Sling swivels were added later. Sometimes they could find a commercial example and use it, or some were made locally, such as this one. The serial number on the underside, and all of these rifles were made in 1943 time period, and they all appear to be in the 1,300,000 serial number range. The markings on the left side of the weapon, we have the Canadian issue mark, the C broad arrow, stamped in 3 places. 1 on the butt, number 2 on the left side of the receiver, and number 3 on the left side of the guard. And the position varies slightly. Here we see an EME sheet for the Winchester Model 1894. This is a Canadian Army document issued to armorers. The Winchester carbines were familiar to many of the men in the P.C.M.R, but there was a big problem. As a civilian hunting carbine, they used soft point ammunition. This was due both to the tubular magazine and the fact that they were a hunting carbine. Since the P.C.M.R were not allowed to use 30-30 soft-nosed bullets in battle, full metal jacket cartridges were required in 30-30, and this was produced specially for them. You'll notice that the military ammunition that was eventually produced at first looks the same. The round-nosed full metal jacket ammunition complied with the laws of war, and it was made specifically for the P.C.M.R. Remington clean bore 160 grains, and the cartridges are marked on the bottom REM UMC 30-30. Now, the most important part of P.C.M.R duties during the war was top secret. This task was reporting Japanese balloon bombs in 1944-1945. Do not be surprised if you've never heard of these balloon bombs, because Canada and the USA kept it top secret for some time. Why, you might ask? Well, the reason was so the Japanese would not know that the balloon bombs were actually reaching North America. It was hoped that the Japanese would give up on the project, and warnings were only issued to the public after 6 people in Oregon were killed when they found and triggered a bomb. The Japanese made large paper balloons and suspended the candelabra underneath each balloon. This candelabra was fitted with 1 or 2 high explosive bombs and 2 to 4 smaller incendiary bombs. There were 32 sandbags as ballast and control instrumentation for the balloon. The balloons were 17 feet, or 5.18 meters tall, and 35 feet, or 10.67 meters in diameter. They were filled with hydrogen. First launched on 3rd of November 1944. A ranger in Royston, British Columbia, told me the story that he was sitting down for lunch when he looked out the window and saw a balloon bomb floating by. He alerted the Royal Canadian Air Force at nearby Comox, and they sent out a fighter plane to force it down. In Canada, the furthest east that a Japanese balloon bomb was found was in Manitoba, and in the USA, one was found in Michigan. Over 9,300 balloon bombs were apparently launched. The Japanese gave up on this project in April 1945, as the silence, due to the secrecy in North America, convinced them that the project was a failure. Warning: these balloon bombs are still being found occasionally. The balloons will have disintegrated long ago, but live bombs, incendiaries, and explosive charges remain dangerous. There are as many as 74 explosive charges on each balloon. If one finds one, the authorities should be notified. October 1945 was the end of the war for the P.C.M.R. The Rangers were allowed to buy their civilian pattern rifles, such as Winchester Model 1894, and a receipt was issued by the company commander. The ideal P.C.M.R rifle for collectors would be a rifle with the original sales receipt, which reveals the Ranger's name and company, and ideally a rifle that was remaining in very nice original condition. I'll just say in closing that looking for a rifle with the original receipt. I love to have the history. Also looking for the various uniforms and insignia, and I'd like to complete my issues of the Ranger magazine. Would be nice to have a piece of the Japanese balloon bomb. Thank you for watching my video, and I hope that you found it to be interesting and educational. So you might want to subscribe. It is free, just let you know when new videos come out. Special thank you to Jim Hawes of Burnaby, British Columbia. Goodbye.